HITRUST likes to surprise. Oh, Todd's just recording it. HITRUST likes to surprise us sometimes, like today when they actually released version 11 of the HITRUST CSF. I don't have a slide for that because it literally came out this morning. I didn't have time to update the presentation, but I'll definitely touch on some of the points that get included in that and how it might differ from the information that's in here as well. HITRUST is a difficult certification to receive. We've definitely seen pain points through our years of doing these assessments. And we know what works well and what doesn't work well. Wolf traditionally does a bit more hand holding than a lot of other firms, especially when it comes to HITRUST. So I want to cover some areas where we learned some lessons, and then some problem areas and common gaps that we identify, not just for us as an assessor, but for you as a client would be undergoing a HITRUST certification. Then I'm going to cover some HITRUST resources to provide some information to you all, and then some key takeaways. And then Todd kind of mentioned the Q&A at the end. So firstly, why HITRUST? So I kind of mentioned earlier, HITRUST was originally developed as a healthcare specific industry security framework. Healthcare really never had a specific type of security framework. It was always just kind of following HIPAA. For anyone that's familiar with HIPAA and the HIPAA security rule, it tends to be pretty mind-numbingly vague within the information it provides. It kind of says things like, do your best or try your hardest, do things, periodically. So the need for a more stringent and strict security framework is really important. So that's kind of where HITRUST came along. There was a lot more, strictness and regulations kind of developing within the healthcare industry in general. The Office of Civil Rights, really has been putting the hammer down on different breaches and, really putting a lot of fines down for any type of breaches that do occur. So there's really been, a lot of need within healthcare to increase security. It's generally one of the weakest industries in general. You can see, every year the Verizon security breach reports come out, and healthcare is always kind of at the top of the fray in terms of breaches. And like I mentioned, there's no certification for HIPAA. It's kind of just something you're supposed to meet and rely on. There really isn't a stamp of approval to show you're certified. So there's definitely a need for something there. HITRUST, just kind of in general, it reduces overall operational risk. It's a standardized, security framework. It was originally built on ISO 27001, but it also combines a number of different regulatory frameworks, security frameworks. And they all kind of combine them to sort of create what HITRUST is today. So now just to touch on the HITRUST assessments that are available. HITRUST, like I mentioned, is based on ISO 27001, but incorporates a number of different security frameworks. So, listed a few of them out here: HITECH, NIST, PCI, FTC, COBIT, some state laws as well. HITRUST, what also makes it unique is that it's adjustable based upon risk factors that are unique to your organization. So with the main type of assessment, which is now called the R2 assessment, that is sort of the tailor-made assessment to your organization. So you basically would fill out a questionnaire within HITRUST tool. It'll tell you, you basically enter in how much data you store, how many people connect to your system, if there's any specific regulatory agencies or requirements you have to meet, and then it'll spit out your assessment, which could be anywhere from 250 controls all the way up to 1,000 controls. And that's kind of your customized assessment to meet HITRUST certification. 3 implementation levels within HITRUST. So there's level 1, which is the baseline requirement, and then there's level 2 and 3, which are built upon unique risk factors such as organizational, system, regulatory. As I mentioned, the more controls you have in scope, the higher level controls you get included in your assessment. The R2 validated assessment. So like I mentioned, it's a 2-year certification. It's based on the 5 levels of HITRUST control maturity. So that is for every control, you have to show that you have a policy in place. You have a procedure that documents the step-by-step requirements on how you're supposed to meet what the policy states. Implementation, so are you actually meeting what the control is looking for? And then there's measure and manage, which are optional. It's essentially, are you setting metrics? Are you managing those metrics appropriately for each one of those controls that you have in scope? I kind of mentioned the number of controls depends on the scoping factors. It's kind of unique for every assessment. It's a 2-year certification, but it requires an interim assessment after year 1, which is basically just a kind of a check-in audit. It's a much lighter lift than, say, your full, R2 assessment, but it is kind of something that needs to be included as you go forward. Lastly, controls can be inherited from service providers. So if your system that you want to be HITRUST certified is hosted, say, within AWS, there's a number of controls that you can then inherit from AWS because they hold a HITRUST certification. Basically, there are controls that you are not responsible for, say physical security, so you can inherit those from them. The weighting is also important when it comes to scoring and proving your certification within HITRUST. You'll see that each implementation area kind of has a specific weight based upon it. So implementation being the highest, with policy and process each having 15 and 20%, and then measure to manage 10 and 15. In order to get certified, all you need to show and score is implementation, process, and policy. Measure to manage are kind of the next level to showing maturity in your environment. The way that the HITRUST CSF is broken out, it's separated into 19 specific domains. Each one of those domains is essentially a category, outlining specific areas for the assessment. So things like business continuity planning, vulnerability management, patch management. And then within each one of those domains is a set number of control requirements. You need to hit a score of 62% to a 70.99% in order to gain certification within all domains. That's kind of how it breaks down based upon the weighting of each score. The lighter and easier type of assessment that HITRUST offers is the I1. The I1 assessment is just a 1-year certification. It's basically, instead of it being tailor-made to your organization, it's a set number of controls. So in this case, 219. It's only implementation. So there's no policy and procedure requirements that are, shown to be applicable to be scored. Additionally, what makes it different is, similar to a SOC 2, if you're kind of familiar with that, you can actually carve out specific controls. So that way, you're not responsible for them. Instead of inheriting them like you would in the R2, you can just simply carve them out. The big difference is that HITRUST requires that you be on the most recent version of the CSF in order to do an I1. So previously, it was version 9.6.2. As of today, actually, it's version 11 now. So they kind of have a sunset period already in place for any assessments created with version 9.6.2. The scoring is a little bit different since it's just implementation. You have to score an 83 in every domain to certify. It's a little bit higher. Now, just to touch on some lessons learned from the HITRUST assessment and HITRUST process. I did mention it's a very difficult process, and it's definitely a bit more stringent than a typical, say, like a SOC 2 or another framework assessment where generally the auditor or the assessed entity or say like with a SOC 2, we would be the ones performing the certification and proving your certification and signing off that you're meeting what the SOC 2 criteria is. HITRUST is different. We wouldn't be the ones providing the certification. It's actually HITRUST themselves. So it tends to add an extra level of difficulty and scrutiny because us as your assessor would prepare you and get you to the point where we'll be submitting it to HITRUST. But then at the end of the day, it's HITRUST who then has to review and sign off to provide the certification. HITRUST is also very strict. They like to see their own language. They're very nuanced in their controls, and they have a lot of, there's definitely a lot of lessons that I've learned from just simply submitting assessments to them. Every time we submit an assessment, there's always something new that they want to see or something that they're keying in on. It can make it sometimes like a moving target, but it also is why it's so important to have a quality assessor working with you to help prepare you for submission and success. The first lesson to learn is you need organizational buy-in. Having leadership and senior leadership and board support for your HITRUST journey is definitely imperative. It's not simply we're going to get HITRUST certified tomorrow and let's just kind of, figure it out. It's a lengthy and it can be a very expensive certification to get, which is why it is really important to have that buy-in from the top levels. Generally, we like to see, say you're a new organization just hopping into HITRUST. It could be anywhere from a 12 to 24-month process to get to certification. It's also, okay, I mentioned it can be expensive as well, depending upon the gaps that you might need or the number of controls that you have in scope. There could be definitely a buy-in from the organization level and some spends that need to happen in order to get to where you need to be to meet what the controls are looking for. It's also important to include not just people from IT, but people from all service lines. HITRUST tends to cover, a large variety of topics within the certification framework. So, it's important to have buy-in from your information security officer, from human resources. If you have a business continuity planning department, it's not strictly an IT specific type certification, really it's all encompassing within your organization. Next is scoping. Having your scope finely tuned is extremely important within your HITRUST process as well. Generally, so HITRUST is a little bit different, where they basically say that you can choose your own scope. However, it is definitely not advised to do it that way. Essentially, the best course of action is to determine what you want to be certified or what your clients will be okay with being certified. Obviously, the goal of HITRUST is to sort of provide something to your clients to show assurance that you have the proper security controls in place. So if your scope isn't, applicable to what they're looking for in a certification, it's not going to be very much use to you or anyone else. So really determining what, first off, you want to be certified, and then also identifying, what are the systems that kind of connect and deal with that environment. So in general, we like this, if anyone's familiar with PCI and the flow of credit card data, you really want to make sure that your scope is as small as possible in order to help, the ease of certification in, not just for you, but also as your assessors as well. So, with that being said, it's up to you, but, start small as you can. Don't include 15 different applications. You can't get your full, corporate environment certified. You really want to make sure it's kind of one specific system within a scoped environment, and that you can kind of wrap your hands around for the certification. HITRUST policy and procedure. So this tends to be the part that we see most of our clients get tripped up, just because it can be a bit of a surprise to realize how much of a paper exercise HITRUST really is. Policies and procedures specifically are very difficult to kind of figure out and document, just because HITRUST has very, I'm trying to think of the best word to describe. They're very specific in what they want to see within your policies and your procedures. Essentially, HITRUST requires that you have a specific policy statement for every single control and scope, as well as a step-by-step who, what, when, where, why, and how procedure for every control and scope as well. And this might also contradict your current policy set, right? If you have a policy set that you already have in place, having a separate HITRUST policy set might seem kind of silly, and it might not seem to even be in the best, security controls. But, getting from where you are probably now to getting them into a spot where HITRUST would be okay with them, it can be a lot of work, and it can be time consuming, especially with procedures. Procedures in general is where we also see, most of our clients trip up because of how specific HITRUST wants to see. They very much like to see their own language, their own wording, and there's a lot of each control has a lot of elements in it, which can be just simple sentences that, you need to copy and paste into your policies and your procedures just to show that you have that information covered for every control. And then, like I mentioned, the procedures, having the step-by-steps, identifying owners, how things are being done, to what they're being done to. It can be a daunting process, and it can take a lot of time to sort of develop and write out these policies and procedures, which is why it's really something to focus on, at the beginning, specifically if you're going for an R2 assessment. I kind of mentioned, just sort of wrap up, preparing for success. So defining the scope early, you talked about, spending time where it counts. So I mentioned policies and procedures, that paper exercise, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot more time than you expect. Implementation, obviously, if there's larger gaps you have to close, or they're very specific controls that might require a spend, being prepared for those. Having a project manager or dedicated team internally, honestly, this is one of the only certifications where I would state that it really helps to have someone on the client end that is very familiar with HITRUST, even to the point of going and getting certified with the CCSFP certification from HITRUST, undergoing the training and kind of really understanding what HITRUST is like. It really does help, just because it is a much more of a collaborative effort between us as your assessor and you as the client than, say, any other type of audit. Training for the MyCSF tool. So HITRUST has this GRC tool that we use to basically submit our assessments to them. So being familiar with the tool and kind of how it works definitely helps as well. And then I kind of mentioned scoping, and being honest and conservative with as you score yourself. In general, we always recommend that our clients take a first pass just reading through the controls and kind of providing a generalized, assessment of where they think they are at meeting these controls. It really just kind of helps, not only as you as the client being familiar of what the HITRUST controls are looking for, but also helps us by getting basically a baseline of where our clients are going to be going forward. Some problem areas and common gaps that we've seen, overall, planning out and timing is the biggest thing. I kind of mentioned previously that HITRUST, it's not we're going to get certified, let's do it tomorrow type of assessment, right? It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money, it takes, energy and resources in order to get yourself from where you are to being certified. There's also some larger gaps that we always tend to run into. If you're not familiar or, never really undergone a security assessment before, those are going to be things like incident response planning, vendor management, performing a BCP or BIA, and in general, the policies and the procedures are always where we see people trip up. And then just be realistic, right? Like, larger organizations, it's going to take longer. There's a lot more people involved. There's a lot more processes that might need to be updated, a lot more controls and tools that need to be put in place. Here I've kind of laid out a couple of resources as well. The HITRUST current version, I might kind of mention previously, this goes to the HITRUST CSF, so it should be updated to version 11. Version 11 also just came out today. There was a previous assessment that I kind of spoke about. That was the I1 assessment. That was sort of the lighter weight implementation only assessment. HITRUST today just also announced the E1. Essentially, the E1 is the essentials certification. It's like the I1, but it has even less controls in place. So essentially, it's a very starting point baseline assessment for anyone who's just really just trying to get their feet wet with HITRUST. It does also have a validated assessment and certification tied along with it. So if you do have clients pushing for HITRUST, it kind of adds, a little bit of breathing room, another level of stating like, we just began our HITRUST journey. We're going to start with the E1, we're going to move to the I1, and then we're going to get to the R2. So a lot of letters and numbers kind of mixed in there, but essentially HITRUST is really trying to push that kind of, getting your feet wet into HITRUST and moving yourself through their processes, from your basic starting point all the way through being a mature and certified organization with HITRUST. Additionally, the links here. So what assessment is right for me? I kind of just spoke about the different types of assessments. HITRUST has some pretty good resources on their website to basically talk about, pick and choose what assessment you prefer to go through, and get an idea of what will be the best way for your organization to sort of meet HITRUST. There's some resource guides from the AICPS as well. And then Mike Canarellis, he is our Chief Growth Officer, and he's kind of our lead and head of our HITRUST organization within Wolf. There's a link to his email as well. He can also provide sample documents as well as I can. Now, I just want to cover some key takeaways from HITRUST that, I kind of spoke throughout the presentation. I know, Todd, if we want to take a quick second, if there's any questions we want to cover briefly.
There's just one question right now. We can maybe wait for the end, Austin, if there's not a whole lot more, but we do have plenty of time for you to cover what you need to do and any other questions, even if they haven't been posed, but I would say you can continue.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just cover some key takeaways that I sort of spoke about, throughout the presentation. I would say first and foremost is choosing a HITRUST assessor that knows your business and that you are comfortable with. I've definitely worked with clients who have previously worked with assessors that, either didn't take the time to really work with their clients and help figure out the scope of their environment, really understand their needs for their certification process, and really be a partner with them to walk them through and guide them through the HITRUST process. I kind of spoke about how difficult of an assessment it is and how, strict and stringent HITRUST can be. And it's really, it's really one of those certifications and processes where you really have to over communicate with your clients. There's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of unknowns or things that, like, simply browsing the HITRUST website or purchasing the MyCSF tool really isn't going to give you that kind of in-depth knowledge that a good HITRUST assessor will give you and guide you through that process. There's a lot of really strict and sometimes strange and frustrating things that might pop up just simply because the HITRUST process can be difficult and different from any other type of assessment you go through, which is why it's really important to pick and choose an assessor that can walk with you and guide you and sort of hold your hand through the whole HITRUST process. Senior management buy-in, I kind of mentioned this as well. HITRUST is expensive. It takes a long time, and it can be something that it's not something that happens overnight. So it's really important to sort of have buy-in from senior management, from your board, just to kind of provide the sort of, strength behind your push to getting HITRUST certified. Once you sort of begin that process and you even go through a gap assessment with a HITRUST assessor, we would provide you with a full list of gaps. And some of those gaps, like I mentioned, could be expensive. They could have a spend tied to them, or it could take time to implement, especially for larger organizations or, environments that are much more sort of solidified. So being able to have that buy-in and that push to move towards HITRUST certification from, senior leadership is really important. Spending time for the scope. I talked about scoping and how important scoping is. I couldn't tell you how many times, we've seen organizations that go through HITRUST certification and, they'll tell us that in their previous engagements that they got all the way through their assessment, and right before it was time to submit, they realized that they actually didn't scope properly. And then it kind of rewinds the clock. They have to begin the assessment again. They have to go through the processes of identifying and adding in these new systems or, scoping. So it's really important to know, the boundaries of where your environment begins and ends. What specific things are going to be included in your scope? Are laptops included? Can they connect to the environment? Can they access sensitive data? Do they need to be tested? Do you have wireless in your facilities that need to be included in the scope? These are things that really need to be, solidified and understood right off the bat. So that way, when you're preparing for your certification process, exactly, that you are prepared, that everything, that will be in scope for your assessment is covered and is mature enough to pass the certification process. Committing resources and having a dedicated project manager, it's really imperative to have that person on your team that can really, bang the drum for HITRUST, that can make sure that, the different business units in your organization are doing what they need to do in order to meet what the controls are looking for, that they're, really leading the charge to make sure that policies and procedures are being generated appropriately, that they're working with, your HITRUST assessor and kind of, working back and forth between what needs to be done, what documentation needs to be provided, what type of information should be shared within the teams, working with your vendors, if there's vendors that need certification information or you need information from them, having that person that, like I kind of mentioned before too, even going and getting certified from HITRUST, having that leader on your team and to kind of, push for HITRUST. And just because, your certification might be complete doesn't mean that HITRUST goes away, right? HITRUST requires sampling for anywhere between 3 months to a year from your assessment start date. So, just because you're certified now doesn't mean you're going to be certified again next time. So making sure that those controls stay in place, that they're still being, completed and performed throughout the year to make sure that, to prevent any issues coming up with your next assessment. Lastly, choosing the report that's right for you. When generally people undergo HITRUST or start the HITRUST journey, it has to do with a client asking them from a vendor due diligence standpoint, show us that you're HITRUST certified or we're not going to do business with you. There's generally some wiggle room there between what they want and what you can provide, right? Which is why HITRUST provides those different levels and options for certification. So I kind of mentioned the very basic being the E1 now, the I1, which is the next level above that, and then the full R2. So understanding that, where you are in your certification process, if you're a small organization with not a lot of resources, and there's a big push for HITRUST, either by your clients or even within your organization in general, someone in your leadership that just wants to get HITRUST certified, being able to level set where you're at and being realistic in the process of, what within our time frame and within our price range is a report that we can meet. So, your assessor as well, we work with a lot of our clients to tell them, what is the most realistic way forward, what certification will give you the value that you need to you and your clients, but also won't break your bank or your backs trying to, get yourself to certification. So, understanding that there are different report levels and that they all provide value in different ways. So I'm a little bit early on Q&A. So I'm happy to sort of, cover some questions now. I don't know if there's
Austin,
any
I can read the two that have been posed. Otherwise, if you'd like to verbalize a question versus typing, if you were to raise your hand, I can see if you're doing so, and then I'm able to click the allow to talk button so you can verbalize your question. But Austin, in terms of the two questions that have been typed out, the first one is there a repository which we can search to see if my company is indeed HITRUST certified?
Good question. There currently is not a repository. I know that like for PCI, you can look on the PCI website or the Visa website and you can see everyone that has a PCI certification. HITRUST is not like that. You can see all the HITRUST assessors on the HITRUST website. There's a full list of them there, but there isn't a full listing of all the organizations that are certified. The closest that you can get to that is within the HITRUST tool, MyCSF. If you're undergoing your assessment, you can see what organizations are certified that you can inherit from. So generally, these are just going to be the larger cloud-based service providers that have undergone a certification. So like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. The big ones are kind of listed out in there for you to inherit from, but otherwise there's no real centralized repository.
Gotcha. Thank you, Austin, for that response. Our second question, if you are ISO 27001 certified, can this be leveraged either directly or indirectly in your HITRUST efforts? And I guess as a second part, is HITRUST largely duplicative with ISO 27001?
Yeah, so there's basically a way that you can leverage your previously used certifications towards your HITRUST certification. So the way that you go about that is if you've, say, undergone and been certified with HITRUST or with ISO, if there's a HITRUST control in scope for your assessment, and it's directly relating to or is similar to a control that you were previously certified within your ISO certification, you can use your ISO certification as evidence to show that you're meeting what that control is looking for. HITRUST has some kind of strict rules on how that's done. It's not simply, here's my ISO certification, this knocks out, all 130 of these controls that I was supposed to meet. You basically have to use that certification as evidence, and then you have to reference specifically within that certification report where it's called out that you're meeting that control. It's similar to a SOC 2 as well. You can use a SOC 2 report as evidence. You can use a PCI report as evidence, but it's not just like an ISO can swap and replace a chunk of the HITRUST assessment. It's basically just using, instead of digging up new evidence to prove that you're meeting this control, you can just attach that report and reference it to use towards your current certification.
Thank you, Austin. And a new question popped up. In your experience, what is the compliance percentage that you see most firms hitting? And as a second part to that, just over the goal line, or are there some hitting all of the marks?
Yeah, so I would say the vast majority of organizations are really only hitting the kind of just over the goal line mark for certification. So that would be, with the R2, only testing and scoring policy, procedure, and implementation. And then, even at 100% in all three of those, you're just hitting what HITRUST would score as a 3+ within the domains. It goes all the way up to a 5+, but only a 3 is required for certification. So most organizations that are getting certified under the R2 are kind of just hitting that line. Like I kind of talked about how HITRUST has that 5-point scoring system where they have measured and managed as well. Those two scoring criteria I generally don't see used very often, just because first off, every control that's scored for measured and managed, HITRUST reviews. So you're getting additional eyes from HITRUST on the stringency and the strictness of how you're scoring and implementing those controls. In addition to that, it's another level of maturity that you really have to meet that most organizations just, once they hit the HITRUST certification line to get certified, a lot of them really aren't taking the next step to go above and beyond, just because of how difficult it is to even hit that baseline for certification. So that's generally what I see is just, people will get to where they need to be to get certified, and that's kind of where they will stay.
Thanks for that, Austin. As of right now, there are no open questions. I guess I allow for a couple of seconds here, either for folks to raise their hand to be called upon to pose a question live or type it out. Otherwise, as a reminder, thank you folks who replied directly with me for their name where I wasn't able to see their full name. Thank you for everyone for their responses. We'll make sure to consider in future webcasts the ability to change that on the fly. Otherwise, I'll just work with you directly to modify to ensure you do get this 1 CPE credit. I will ping to the group here right now, but also send via email when we attach the slides along with the future link to the YouTube. Just a quick Google form survey for any and all feedback related to this presentation. Would really love to hear it. I know for one, we'll look into enabling captions into future presentations so folks are able to understand what's going on via multiple ways. But I'll ping that here for everyone to kindly consider filling out. And I will, like I said, make sure to add that to the future email as well. There was another question that did just pop up there as I drew out that wrap up, Austin. The question is, are the HITRUST documents free or must they be purchased?
Yeah, so HITRUST provides some resources for free on their website. These are just generally going to be kind of templates of what the reports look like, or the information about the CSF itself. I believe that the full HITRUST CSF is available for download as well, just to kind of see what the control requirements look like. But in order to kind of get that tailored approach to what controls might be in scope, or even more importantly, HITRUST, for each HITRUST control, there's also a list of illustrative procedures that go along with it. Now, this has just recently been changed with version 11, but all the previous versions, the control statement doesn't tell the whole story, right? A control statement might say, are you inventorying all assets on your network? But in addition to that, there's illustrative procedures that are a part of that control requirement. And those illustrative procedures might include, 5 to 10 different additional elements that you're required to meet in order to be in compliance with that control statement. So that type of information, you're not going to be able to see just from having the CSF. With that, you pretty much have to purchase the full HITRUST tool to get access to it, to be able to view all that additional information from those controls. Version 11, they just changed, so those elements are now a part of the full requirement statement. So you don't need to really review the illustrative procedures. All those kind of provide now or additional information on what us as an assessor would be testing or reviewing in order to, ensure you're meeting what the controls are looking for. But other than that, like I mentioned, there is some decent resources available on the HITRUST website. In addition, their advisories are really good for kind of staying up to date with what new information and releases are coming out from them. They have a full forum for posting questions. Emailing their support team is also really useful for having any questions that you might have as well. They also have a number of help pages and glossaries available on their website to kind of provide information additionally too.
Thanks for that, Austin. Otherwise, no questions right now, just some feedback for some folks regarding the great presentation. Thank you, Austin, so much for your time, and everyone else, of course, for spending your afternoon with us today. Like I mentioned, email will come out shortly with the link to the presentation, video to follow. Actually, another question here, Austin, does HITRUST require an independent audit from internal audit, for example, as part of the ongoing process?
Yeah, definitely a great question. So actually one of the HITRUST control requirements, I believe it's within domain 1, actually requires an independent audit be performed, and the HITRUST assessment doesn't count towards that. So you need to sort of show that you've had an independent audit, reviewed and requested, that you've had it been performed within the past year, and that you kind of have a process for remediating any of those findings that have come out of that audit. So this can be anything from, as you mentioned, an internal audit, as long as it's kind of performed by someone independent and qualified. It could be, a HIPAA security audit or an IT assessment performed by an external firm. But yes, it is required as part of one of the HITRUST control requirement statements to meet towards certification.
Gotcha. All right, just one more check here to see if there's any other open questions.
Yeah, and again, like I said, my information is here. So if you have any other questions that you want, either just about HITRUST or, information security in general, feel free to reach out, shoot me an email or give me a call. I'm more than happy to kind of answer any questions that you might have. Like I mentioned, HITRUST is a difficult process. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of things that, you might just not know without spending years and years literally going through different assessments with them. So I'm happy to kind of answer any questions that anyone might have in the future.
Gotcha. Thank you, Austin. We will wrap things up at this time. I will stop the recording. Like I said, that will be available in the future. Keep a lookout for the link. Otherwise, the presentation materials will be sent shortly thereafter. Austin, thank you again for your time. Thank you, everyone else, for helping this webcast happen. I hope you have a lovely rest of your afternoon week. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Bye.